Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to look at what you should consider before buying a VR headset, what type of flying it's most useful for, what it feels like, and some of the limitations that you'll run into along the way. VR is often touted as the most game-changing peripheral for flight sim, and there's really no way to render it justice on a 2D video like this, but like anything, there are trade-offs, so we'll try to clear all of that up so that you can make the decision that's right for you. Now, before even considering getting into VR, you first have to look at your computer setup because, as I learned, it can truly make or break your experience. And the big three components, so your CPU, GPU, and RAM, are what's going to determine what you can and can't do. When I bought my headset about a year or so ago now, I had what I'll call average specs for the time with a 12th gen CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3070, which gave me pretty good performance on a normal 2K screen. VR was a different story though, and that same setup sometimes resulted in tearing and stutters even in simple planes like the C172, and even turning the in-game graphics down fairly low didn't help much either. That quickly led me down the path of upgrading my PC, which obviously cost me even more, and I swapped out my GPU for a 4070 Ti Super and upgraded my RAM as well, which altogether made a huge difference, and the image tearing issues that I was having went away. Running Flight Sim in VR is a lot more demanding than running it on a regular screen though, and what I've found is that you have to sacrifice a bit on visual quality to maintain good performance, which is even more important in VR because even small stutters can be very jarring. For example, you can get away with higher settings in general aviation planes, both in 2020 and in 2024, but when it comes to airliners, even in 2020, which is generally lighter to run, I need to turn my settings down a fair bit if I want to fly something like the 777 in VR. Where I'm flying can also have a big impact on performance, and say if I'm going into LaGuardia, New York City, I know that I'll need to turn the settings down just a bit more since it's such a heavy area to fly in. Strangely though, I find scaling the graphics back like this doesn't seem to have as much of a visual impact as if I did the same thing on a regular screen, and I think it's in large part because of how it gives you that 365-degree immersion so you don't notice it as much. In fact, the planes where I get the most from my setup are steam gauge planes like the TBM 850 and the C310R, since it allows me to use DLSS anti-aliasing without having blurry Garmin displays, and like that I can get away with higher LODs too. On top of that, there are a lot of things you can tweak to improve your performance in VR, from different runtimes like Steam VR to software like Virtual Desktop that can get you better clarity, and even tweaking the DLSS settings can help boost your FPS. With that in mind though, two things you're going to need are patience and a decent comfort level with tweaking and configuring your setup to get the best performance that you can, because it can feel a bit overwhelming and confusing at times. On a related note, as we go through the video, you'll notice a bit of shaking at times as well as some flickering at the edges of the screen, and both of these are artifacts of how I'm capturing the VR footage, and you wouldn't normally notice either of them when you have the VR headset on. Now, obviously, to do VR, you're going to need a headset as well, and although I don't want to spend too much time on this since I want to focus on the VR experience as a whole, I'll share how I went about deciding on the Quest 3. Each headset has different features, from clarity to field of view, comfort, and even how you connect it to your computer can be different from one to the other, but I found that it was really hard to compare these headsets just on specs. To be honest, the main reason I ended up settling on the Quest 3 is because it felt like the most value for money, especially since I didn't know what I was getting myself into at the time, but it really feels like it hits the sweet spot of not too expensive and a well-rounded feature set. An additional factor for me is that, as you can tell, I wear glasses, and depending on the frame style, I could see some headsets fitting better than others, so if you can, it's probably best to try it on for size first. You can get lens inserts with your eye prescription for all of the major headsets though if you want, which I think would make it a bit more comfortable, although honestly I don't really find that I have an issue with my glasses specifically. Either way you go about it, the focal length of the headset's lenses determines how clearly you can see in VR and not the distance from the actual screens. So if you're nearsighted like me, you're likely going to need them in VR as well to keep everything from looking blurry. Out of the box, a lot of these headsets are somewhat uncomfortable to have on for an extended period of time though, because they put a lot of pressure on the front part of your face. The solution for that, at least for the Quest, was to replace the head strap with a third-party one, which made it a whole lot more comfortable by moving the weight more towards the back of your head, but it really should come with something better out of the box if you ask me. Speaking of comfort, one thing I was worried about because I am prone to it is the slight dizziness or vertigo that you can get with VR because there's no associated motion, which can feel a bit uncomfortable. I definitely felt it more when I first got the headset, but I think my brain sort of got used to it, and the only thing that really still gives me trouble now is if I were to load into an aerobatic plane and start doing loops and rolls. There's also definitely a learning curve to operating the headset in conjunction with your computer and flight sim all at the same time, and there are a lot of different ways that you can go about configuring your experience. When you first put it on, you'll be put into what feels like a movie theater with a giant display of flight sim that's basically a 2D projection, and once you're ready, you can then swap it into 3D at the press of a button. Most headsets come with dedicated hand controllers that you can use to operate the dials and switches in the plane, and you can theoretically use them to fly too, but when you're used to having dedicated hardware, it's kind of hard to go back, and I really only use the headset controllers to access and go through the menus. The only downside to using your real hardware is that with the headset on, it becomes near impossible to see them, so you sort of have to learn to do things by feel only, but honestly, muscle memory kicks in pretty fast, and within a couple of flights, I've gotten the hang of it. I also don't use the headset for every flight either, probably more like 1 out of 4 flights, just because most of the time I don't feel like going through that extra setup overhead, and I just want to get in and do a quick flight. In terms of the types of flying that I do with it, I'd say the number one thing that it's great for is becoming more comfortable with a new plane by doing a lot of pattern work. Just because of that immersion that it gives you into the world, you feel a lot more connected to it. I'd also really like to do some cross-country VFR flying without a GPS with it, because being able to see the world in 3D around you makes it ideal for that type of flying, but it's kind of hard to do in areas that you're not familiar with because you don't have access to a sectional style map in VR. There are tools like FS Desktop and All-in-One that allow you to overlay apps in the VR environment so that you can view Navigraph and things like that, but I don't actually use them because I like keeping my install as simple as possible for stability reasons. You can use the built-in tablet on planes with an integrated tablet holder though, like the X-Cub and the DA62 have, but otherwise the tablet is still not functional as of Sim Update 1 when I'm recording this, but once it is, it'll address most of my issues. Similarly, if you use printed checklists or even just PDF versions of them on a second screen, they're going to be basically impossible to use when you're in VR, even though most of them are in the EFB in 2024, so hopefully that'll help once it's available in all planes. For IFR flights, be it with a GA plane or an airliner, I'll do everything up to taxi in 2D, most of the time with the headset off, just because in some planes it's easier to have the flight plan up on my second screen or tablet. That'll include loading up the sim, entering my flight plan and performance data, and once I'm ready to start the engines and push back is where the headset will come on. It is pretty cool to have that giant 2D projection available though, so in planes where I can get away with using only the plane's built-in tools, like say the 737, I'll go headset on right away and do everything that way instead, all the way through to the climb until I turn the autopilot on. At that point, once everything is starting to calm down is when I'll take the headset off and monitor everything on my regular screen, and I'll usually put it back on pretty late in the descent, usually as I'm getting to the initial approach fix. Doing it that way means that most of the setup for the approach is already done, and all I need to do is extend flaps and gear and do final landing checks, which is all easily manageable in VR. I focused a lot on the drawbacks and limitations so far because they're easier to articulate, but I have to emphasize how incredible it feels every time you load into and look around in a new plane, because it truly feels like you're sitting in the cockpit. It also does an amazing job of giving you a sense of scale for each plane, be it in a cramped one-seater where you can barely turn around to the 777's massive flight deck, and as silly as it sounds, you feel like you could literally reach out and touch the controls. Once you're ready to get moving, taxiing around feels so much more natural because you can turn your head and look where you want to go, and it's as close as you can get the feeling like you're moving a real plane. One problem that I have when I'm flying on a normal screen is that I spend way too much time staring at the instruments rather than looking out the windows, but VR does an amazing job of breaking that habit by just immersing you completely in its world. It's a similar story when you're coming into land because it gives you a level of situational awareness that's hard to reproduce with just regular screens, the only exception to that maybe being a full multi-screen setup. What you can never get from a 2D screen though is the depth perception that VR gives you, and you can almost feel the ground rising to meet you, and it helps to make your landings and everything else feel more organic. You obviously don't feel the acceleration or the G's on landing, but it adds so much to your sense of flying because it blocks out the real world around you and you start to forget that you're sitting at a desk pressing buttons. It's impossible to not have a wow moment every time you put it on, and when it comes down to it, unfortunately, no one can really be told what VR is like. It's something you have to try for yourself. If you learned something useful today, please make sure to like the video to get more content like this and subscribe on your way out so that you don't miss out on the next one.